Well, I guess we're ready to begin. I want to welcome you to this panel, which the subject of which is mass incarceration. I don't know, the title, I guess, that was given to this is The End of Mass Incarceration with a question mark. I'm not sure if that's optimistic or not, but that's one of the things we're going to talk about. I'm Judge Edelman. I'm a district court judge in the Eastern District of Wisconsin. I'll be moderating this panel. I think the reason I'm here is since the Supreme Court's decision in Booker, which loosened up the federal sentencing guidelines some years ago, I've been real involved, at least in the form of writing about what the effects of this are, both in opinions and other ways. And we have a very distinguished group of panelists with knowledge of various aspects of this problem. Let me just introduce them briefly. I won't go through all their biographies, which are in your program. We have Nikichi Taifa as a senior policy analyst for the Civil and Criminal Justice Reform at the Open Society Policy Institute, and she formerly was a legislative counsel for the ACLU, and she's taught a seminar at Howard Law School on racial disparity in the criminal justice system. And on her left is Mark Maurer, who is the executive director of the Sentencing Project, and he's one of the country's leading experts on sentencing policy and the criminal justice system. He's written extensively on this subject. Next to me is Glenn Ivey, who's the state's attorney for Prince George's County, Maryland. He's elected every 4 years and has the job of prosecuting crimes in the county. And he also has extensive experience on Capitol Hill, having worked for Representative Conyers and Senators Daschle and Sarbanes. And Donald Brayman, next to Mr. Ivey, is the professor of law at George Washington University Law School. He teaches criminal law and evidence. He's also a professional anthropologist, and he's written recently a number of important articles about the subject of criminal justice. And I guess I'd like to start off the panel just by reading a brief couple paragraphs from an article that appeared several years ago called "Why Are So Many Americans in Prison?" And then I'll read this couple paragraphs, and then I guess I'd like Mark Maurer to maybe respond, and then we'll open it up for the panelists to see whether they agree or disagree or whatever. According to a 2005 report of the International Center for Prison Studies in London, the United States, with 5% of the world's population, houses 25% of the world's inmates. Our incarceration rate, 714 per 100,000 residents, is almost 40% greater than those of our nearest competitors, the Bahamas, Belarus, and Russia. Other industrial democracies, even those with significant crime problems of their own, are much less punitive. Our incarceration rate is 6.2 times that of Canada, 7.8 times that of France, and 12.3 times that of Japan. We have a correction sector that employs more Americans than the combined workforces of General Motors, Ford, and Walmart, the three largest corporate employers in the country, and we are spending some $200 billion annually on law enforcement and corrections at all levels of government, a fourfold increase over the past quarter century. Never before has a supposedly free country denied basic liberty to so many of its citizens. In December 2006, some 2.25 million persons were being held in the nearly 5,000 prisons and jails that are scattered across America's urban and rural landscapes. 1/3 of inmates in state prisons are violent criminals convicted of homicide, rape, or robbery, but the other 2/3 consist mainly of property and drug offenders. Inmates are disproportionately drawn from the most disadvantaged parts of society. On average, state inmates have fewer than 11 years of schooling. They are also vastly disproportionately black and brown. So that's the state we're in today, and I guess I'd like to, again, start with Mark Maurer and ask us the question of how did we get to this point?
Well, thank you, Judge Adelman. Is this on? Yeah. It's a long story, and it's a sad story, I think, but let me just try to sort of frame the contours of what this looks like. And just the scale of what we're talking about, goes back to the early 1970s. That was a time there were about 300,000 people in prison or jail in the United States, 300,000, and now 2.3 million today. So 2 million more people behind bars. There's something wrong with this picture. In broad terms, what we've seen is a change in policy and not crime rates. That explains this, a change in policy. Basically, what's come to be called the Get Tough movement, and get tough on crime in the sense that we will address the problem by sending more people to prison and keeping them there for longer periods of time. That's been the thrust of the policy, and it's been a very conscious one also. It doesn't mean that crime is not a problem and may be more of a problem in some communities at some times. It doesn't mean that crime doesn't go up or down according to various factors, but by and large, it's this change in policies that we're looking at. In three basic ways is what we've seen these changes take place. Overall sentencing policy, then the war on drugs in particular, and then the whole system of parole revocation. Let me just sketch out a little bit about each of those. Sentencing policy basically has become more fixed, more determinate, more punitive over this period of time, most prominently through widespread adoption of mandatory sentencing. The federal system, almost every state has at least some provisions for mandatory sentencing. We have policies of truth in sentencing that supposedly are supposed to bring truth to the courtroom, but their real goal is to bring longer prison terms, and they've achieved that if that's what they want to do. Policies like 3 strikes and you're out, which half the states adopted in the 1990s. Of the states that have such policies, California is by far the most extreme. Your first 2 strikes have to be serious or violent felonies. Your 3rd strike can be any felony in the state of California. Some of you are familiar with this. The California law was challenged in the U.S. Supreme Court in 2003. The question was it cruel and unusual? The 2 cases that came before the court, Ewing and Andrade, in one, the man's 3rd strike involved stealing 3 golf clubs from a sporting goods store. He walked out of the store, had the golf clubs in his pants. Second one involved a man who stole $153 worth of videotapes from a Kmart store. Supreme Court looked at this and rejected their argument, basically said, if this is what the California legislature believes it needs in order to fight crime, who are we to tell them otherwise? And so the golf club thief is now doing 25 to life, and the videotape thief is doing 50 to life in California. This is what our crime control policies look like, at least on the extremes. Our sentencing policies, too, are, I don't know if we call them irrational, but there's somehow this belief that when legislators enact new laws, we need 5 years for this, we need 10 years for this, as if this is based on some sort of scientific principle that's universal. One of the reasons we lock up more people in other countries is because we're just more punitive. There's been some work done internationally comparing sentencing practices, and not just at the extremes like 3 strikes, but for ordinary crime, so-called. The average person going to prison for burglary in the United States is going to spend twice as long in prison as a burglar in England and 3 times as long as a burglar in Canada. This is not based on some scientific evidence that 3 times as long as Canada somehow has some more public safety benefits that it brings. It's just this is sort of culturally, politically determined is where it comes from. So that's the big sentencing change. The most significant element of this has been the so-called war on drugs since the 1980s, and here the scale is very dramatic. We go from a point of about 40,000 people in prison or jail for a drug offense in 1980, 40,000. Today that figure is 500,000. So more people locked up for a drug offense today than the entire prison and jail population back in 1980. In large part, these are not, the people locked up are not the so-called kingpins of the drug trade. They're drug users, they're drug sellers who are selling drugs to support their own drug addiction, selling drugs because they don't have other sources of economic opportunity or don't perceive that, and very disproportionately low-income communities of color affected by it. 2/3 of the people in prison jail for drug offense are African American or Latino, far at a proportion to the degree that those groups use or sell drugs. So essentially, I think we don't have a war on drugs, we have a sort of two-tiered war on drugs. When the children of well-off people in middle-class communities, suburban communities, have a drug problem, the criminal justice system is not the solution, but rather treatment programs, public health approaches are the solution. When it's low-income communities, it's a criminal justice problem. We have very different ways of looking at it. Finally, the third sort of critical area that doesn't get much attention but is very important is the whole nature of what happens on parole when people are released from prison out in the community and can be revoked back to prison for committing a new crime or for a violation of the technical conditions of parole, drug or alcohol use, associations, and things like that. The reason this is important is because these decisions are very highly discretionary, highly arbitrary in many cases by individual parole officers or agencies, and it's an area that's changing very rapidly, mostly for the worse. In the 1980s, about 1 of every 6 people going to prison was going into prison on a parole violation. That figure's now doubled, so it's 1 of 3 people did the prison parole violation. Many of these are for technical violations. Now, the only good news there is that a number of states, a number of parole agencies are beginning to recognize that this is a problem that they can address, that having different sets of decisions, resources, coordination can make a difference in how many people are sent back to prison, and we're starting to see some change in some jurisdictions, but the overall numbers are still very substantial. So all in all, we have decided to get tough as a society. Toughness has meant a world record prison population, and I think it's left many of us feeling very dissatisfied, much of the public, whether it's the best approach to crime and all sorts of other consequences for families and communities that we can get into as well.
Can I just jump in for a minute here?
Yeah. Very free form here.
Okay, thank you. I feel that one cannot comprehensively address issues of mass incarceration and the U.S. criminal justice system until one honestly addresses the issue of race and the impact of racism in the criminal justice system, which is underpinning everything that Mark just said. And because of the severity of the problem and because of its impact on public confidence in the criminal justice system, the importance of race is a key influence, and the manner in which the criminal justice system is administered must be honestly acknowledged. People of color are subjected to disparate treatment at virtually every stage of the criminal justice process, whether you're talking about the selective deployment of law enforcement personnel in communities of color, whether you're talking about issues involving police misconduct and brutality, whether you're talking about stops and arrests premised on racially biased profiles, whether you're talking about, in some cases, the abuse of prosecutorial discretion in issues of charging and pre-trial detention, or whether you're talking about the lack of diversity in jury pools or the improper use of peremptory challenges to exclude people of color from juries, all the way down to the racial disparities in mandatory minimum sentences, including 3 strikes, and the crack powder disparity to the racial administration of the death penalty. All of these issues are issues that need to be front and square on the table. And I will say this, maybe nobody wanted it. Maybe nobody planned it. And I would not at all say that there was a conspiracy. But I will say that for the past 30 years, the clear and overriding message being sent out there is that the war on drugs has essentially been a war on people of color. Despite the fact that whites make up the majority of those who use cocaine in this country, but despite the fact that whites make up the majority of those trafficked in cocaine in this country, you have overwhelmingly people of color. Over 80% are the ones who are arrested and imprisoned for drug crimes. Why? Because in a political environment that basically demands that something be done, oftentimes they are the easiest and the most politically expedient to arrest. I will say that the disparity in penalty between crack and powder cocaine stands out as one of the most notorious examples of racial disparity in the criminal justice system. From 1991 to about 1995, I served as, what was I? I forgot my title. Legislative counsel. Thank you, Mark, because you were around back then. I served as legislative counsel for the American Civil Liberties Union's Washington office, and those were the days when the Omnibus Crime Bill of 1994 was being drafted and debated in the very same Congress that ultimately embraced the largest expansion of the death penalty in modern times. The same Congress that implemented those infamous three strikes laws that Mark talked about earlier. The same Congress that implemented overly broad gang provisions and the prosecution of 13-year-olds as adults. And it was during this time when the United States Sentencing Commission called for public comment on a variety of issues, as they usually do, and one of those issues was the disparity between crack and powder cocaine. And I was new at the ACLU at that time, and one of my colleagues from the Federal Public Defenders Association actually said, Nikita, you ought to go over there and testify on the crack versus powder cocaine issue. And I really had no idea what she was talking about. I didn't know anything about that issue back then in the early 90s. I'm saying, why in the world would she want me to talk about me? All we know, the young black men, they're in prison for crack cocaine. They're herded against the, against the wall, and they use crack. I was very ignorant at the time. Me, who considered myself a very progressive, I don't know how young of an attorney I was at that, but young attorney at the time, was completely oblivious to what was actually the scenario. See, I also was inundated with the massive media images of those young black men being herded off to prison, and I was under the illusion, that the reason being is that more blacks use crack than white. That was my first shock when I found out statistically from the National Institute on Drug Abuse's own statistics that in fact was not true. And the more and more I delved into this issue, I said, oh my goodness, when I found out that a couple of packs of sugar equal about 5 grams, coming up in DC educational system, I really never had a firm view of grams and pounds and all like that. But it wasn't about this. We're talking about a couple of sugar packets. 5 grams gets a first-time nonviolent offender 5 years in prison. And if they're not a first-time offender, my goodness. But first-time offender, 5 grams of crack. If it was, it takes 500 grams, about a pound of sugar, to get that same 5-year sentence for powder cocaine. But it goes even deeper than that, because I see my dear state's attorney is already eating this. Hold up your Mr. Goodbar if you can. Yeah.
And I want everybody else's too.
Only had enough for everybody else got a flyer, But basically, it's low-hanging fruit. This is 50 grams here. We're not talking about boatloads and truckloads and cargo plane loads. We're talking about candy bar size crack quantity cases get you 10 years in prison. 50 grams, about the weight of an ordinary candy bar. These surely are not the large-scale, high-level drug traffickers that Congress intended these lengthy sentences for. Yet for the past 23 years, that is what they have been subjected to. And just as I'm coming to a close on this part, Judge, the Sentencing Commission heard comment, and this was in 1995, submitted a report to Congress, a very comprehensive report in which they studied this issue from every conceivable angle, and in a very professional and sensible way, unanimously agreed that the sentences for simple possession of crack must be equal to simple possession of any other drug, i.e. it must not be a felony. Crack is the only drug for which simple possession is a felony. And the majority of the commissioners said that distribution of crack cocaine should be equal to distribution of powder cocaine. Congress did not agree with them. This was the first time in the history of the commission, out of over 500 recommendations submitted from the commission to Congress, that they thumbed their nose at their own body of experts. But even more egregiously, Congress told the commission, go back and study it more and do not come back here with a proposal that denotes equality of sentences. You must come back with some type of inequality. And even more disturbingly, despite the fact that Congress disagreed with the commission's recommendations, President Clinton at that time had the power to override that decision, and he chose not to do so, and that actually happened to be on the eve of the Million Man March. Since that time, this commission has submitted 3 additional reports to Congress, 4 reports in total, calling for reform of this issue, the most recent being in 2007. And they also submitted a report after its 15-year tenure as the commission, saying that the disparity, the disparity between crack and powder cocaine is the single most important issue differentiating between blacks and whites in the criminal justice system. And if that gap is closed, it would significantly increase equality, I guess you could say, in the system. So I was fighting that fight back then in the early 90s. I'm still fighting that fight now. Many of the myths, crack baby myth, the myth of increased violence, many of those myths have been shown to be either exaggerated or seriously overblown. But there are some bright lights now in this particular Congress, because we think we might be on the verge of really rectifying this scenario. So,
Thank you. Professor?
Yeah, if I could just follow up on with 2 points. So I'm an anthropologist, and a lot of the work that I do is following families of prisoners, and I looked at the issues that you were looking at. But for me, it's not just about the person who's being locked up. It's about the ripple that locking one person times however many people in that community or in a family you lock up has in the families and communities that are historically disadvantaged. And so the same discrepancies that you're talking about have a kind of ripple effect on communities, on family structure, on the amount of income coming into a household, on the welfare of children, on the likelihood of children being abused or neglected because their parents aren't in the family, the household, or the community to take care of them. And so you can begin to, once you start thinking about it in that way, you start to see that it can have effects on families and communities. And a lot of criminologists have caught on to this, and they're starting to talk about mass incarceration as criminogenic. That's it, it creates more crime because it's creating the conditions in which social disorder is likely to occur. Right? If you keep pulling people in and out of a community and sending them back and forth to prison, you can imagine that's not going to have a good effect on family life or on community life. And eventually you create substantial social disruption that fosters crime. Now, as an anthropologist, I'm not as interested in crime rates as they are. I'm interested in the effect that has on family and community life itself. And you can start to see how that works, right? The less you have family and community life there, the more the policymakers want to step on the pedal and push harsher, longer sentences to kind of back up what they see as a crumbling social infrastructure. But the harder they push, the more the infrastructure crumbles. And so we've got a kind of vicious cycle going on there, and it's one that disproportionately affects historically disadvantaged communities, the vast majority of which are black and Latino. And so you can see effects from mass incarceration on rates of single parent households, on poverty rates, on problems that children are facing, just nutritional problems because they're having trouble bringing enough money into the household to feed children. And so I would just say, think about the hidden effects too, and we have to face up to what's going on there. And so it's not just about the criminal offenders who are suffering disproportionately in these neighborhoods. It's about the entire neighborhood and how we think about what's going on there. And I'll just say one more thing about the quote that the judge opened up with. Why are so many people in prison? And I think some of the good news is that it's not because the public wants them there. The public, by and large, has not wanted to lock up so many people. It's a misimpression that many people have about public opinion. In fact, when you ask people what they want, 90%, or just about 90%, give or take a few percentage points, say that they strongly favor the implementation of community-based sanctions, mandatory drug treatment, mandatory job training, mandatory education. And that's not something that's particular to progressives. It turns out that's true within a couple percentage points, whether or not you're a Democrat or Republican, whether or not you call yourself a liberal or a conservative. This is something that cuts across party and ideological lines. The public has been astute, and they've been way ahead of us in terms of policy and what they're interested in. What they do want to see is a system that holds offenders accountable in meaningful ways to victims, so paying restitution, victim compensation, making sure that they do work so that they do the things that ordinary citizens have to do, like get a job, pay taxes, and those sorts of things, go through drug treatment if they have a drug problem. And they want the state to make sure that that happens. But that's the sort of thing that they strongly favor. And when you ask them whether they favor those sorts of things or prisons, they favor them usually by at least a margin of 3 to 1. So it's not something that that the public has demanded or is demanding. And I think that legislators, prosecutors, judges, we're catching up with the kind of common sense approach that that the public has been asking for and looking for. And frankly, I don't think it's any surprise that the public is dissatisfied with the criminal justice system, which is usually the kind of one-line survey question that they get asked. Well, who wouldn't be dissatisfied with the criminal justice system, right? I mean, liberals and conservatives have their own reasons, but they're all looking for a kind of similar common sense resolution to these issues.
Sure. Let me pick up where the professor left off. I think that the public is pretty dissatisfied right now with the criminal justice system for a variety of reasons. I don't disagree with anything that's been said by the panel so far. But, well, for those of you that don't know, I'm the state's attorney, which is the district attorney. I'm the prosecutor in Prince George's County, which covers the eastern side of Washington, D.C. And my community is roughly 2/3 African American, probably at this point about 15% Latino, maybe 20%. The rest is white. And when I ran for office the first time in 2002, it was probably like 70+% African American. So I'm going to speak about the African American community that I represent and sort of the concerns that they've raised with me on the campaign trail in that election, the second election, and on a day-to-day basis. Now that I've been on TV a lot, people stop me in the store, at the games, or whatever, and say they have concerns about this and that. So I hear a lot from them. And the things that they're concerned about are kind of twofold. And they reflect the sort of dichotomy in the public debate. On the one hand, all the things that have been said here, they share those views. Too many of our boys are being incarcerated. They're getting too much jail time. And they're prosecuted for things that, if it had been a white boy, he probably wouldn't have gotten to jail for it. But when they say that, they're talking about drug cases by and large. The other thing they're concerned about is violent crime. Prince George's County had around 120 homicides last year. That was more than Newark, in a lot of comparable cities. If you did a per capita kind of calculation, we'd probably be way up, I'd guess at least in the top 30 in the country. And they're very concerned about that, too. So we'll have situations like, I guess it was week before last, we had graduation at Flowers High School, which is the science and tech magnet for the central part of the county. And at the graduation party, one woman was killed and 3 others were shot. And you get this sort of how can you have a shooting at a graduation party? You get sort of that kind of disbelief. A deacon gets shot in the parking lot. You had that in the D.C. too a little while ago. And then when you see the types of homicide cases that come through, and you're looking at, he shot me because I looked at his girl, I took his seat, I cut in line, I dissed him, which can be almost anything. We had one in D.C., refused to give him a hamburger, refused to give him a cigarette. These are real homicide cases in Prince George's County in the district. By the way, I was a prosecutor in D.C. in the early 90s, from 90 to 94. And so they look and they see like, well, we've got these sort of two sets of problems, and usually when I hear people talking about them, they're only talking about one set. So when we get to groups like this, liberal Democrats, and I consider myself to be one of them, usually when we're talking about incarceration, implicitly we're talking about drug cases. Okay? The 2.3 million, I think it's about 500,000, are in their nonviolent first-time offenders. When I started speaking out against that after I got elected, I had my advisors saying, you better be careful, the voters are going to turn on you. But what I found quickly was that they supported that. On the other hand, I go to panels with conservative Republicans. Or when I worked on the Hill in '87, I started with Congressman Conyers, who now chairs the House Judiciary Committee. Same dichotomy, and it's been there for 20 years. And so the public's looking at it, and they're like, you're telling us to pick A or B, but we know C is the real answer. And we're not giving them that. So one of the things I hope that we can think about is trying to form a dialogue where we actually present comprehensive approaches to the crime solution. So if we're going to talk about crime, and I think we do need to talk about getting more people out of jail. When I talk to the public about drug treatment on demand or drug courts, those kinds of things, they're excited about them. They poll really high. They're in the 70s everywhere I've looked, 70 to 80%. But they also, when they poll us, the last poll I took, question number one, what's your biggest concern? Number one's crime. And then you break it down. What types of crimes are you concerned about? Usually it's violent crime. We have a little auto theft blip out here in the county, but other than that, it's violent crime. We've got to find a way to start talking about both sets of problems. When I first became a prosecutor in 1990, crack had just come to Washington, D.C., and we were averaging then about 450 to 500 homicides per year. Prince George's County was in the 150 to 200 range, and if you go up 95, 30 miles, you're at Baltimore, which is also in the 500 range or so. So just in this little 30-mile radius, you're talking about 1,100 homicides a year. Those numbers have come down, but they're still way too high. Homicide's still the leading cause of death for African-American males, young African-American males, not just in Prince George's County, but nationwide, and that's been true since crack swept across the country. We've got to come up with a response that addresses that. Now, I had a group meeting 2 days ago, and this is a group, we're pushing the Boston strategy, Cincinnati, whatever, High Point strategy, which appears to address a lot of these issues, and I'll come back to that, because I think it's a solution that, it's not perfect, there are problems, but it's worked pretty well in the jurisdictions that they've tried it, and I think it addresses some of the issues you talked about the lack of racial reconciliation between law enforcement and some of these communities and the like. But let me stop here, and I'll come back to some of these. But at the end of the day, the big thing I'm pushing everywhere I go is we've got to walk and chew gum at the same time. I don't mind talking about getting more people out of jail because it would be the right thing to do, but we got to get the right people out of jail. And we got to make sure we don't give short shrift in groups like this to issues like homicide, domestic violence, sexual assault, because they tend to not get discussed in a lot of these kinds of conversations. But the public wants to hear that. And I think especially in African American communities that are really struggling with these kinds of issues, the normalization of incarceration is a huge problem. So many guys go to jail, there's no stigma to it anymore, and they come back with habits, mores, whatever. For example, the low-hanging jeans, you've seen that stuff? Have you ever seen those?
Yeah.
You guys were? Okay. That came out of jail. The guys, they don't have belts. They don't give them belts. And they wear the overalls, the orange jumper stuff, and the pants hang down. So when the guys came out of jail, they brought it with them. Right now, what I've got in Maryland, in Prince George's County, what's coming out of the jail is the Bloods and the Crips, who are infiltrating this area through the prison system. that's a big problem. So yeah, I'll stop there. But I look forward to hearing from you all too on your guidance on this, because I think we need to try and find new solutions and new approaches in winning over the public, especially politically, to try and move more of this agenda forward.
Well, that sort of raises the question of politically. I mean, it sounds like there's something of a consensus, more or less, that what we're doing isn't working, but we don't really hear very much about this from policymakers. So how do we translate what all you agree on to getting some changes?
Actually, we are beginning to hear from policymakers. Congressman Bobby Scott has introduced a bill called the Youth Promise Act, which looks at prevention issues before youth get involved in the criminal justice system and the juvenile justice system, and bringing programs and policies and programs and intervention strategies, bringing together all segments of the community, from law enforcement to social service providers to defense attorneys and the like, academicians, to really try to find those comprehensive approaches that Glenn Ivey spoke about. There's also the Justice Integrity Act, which looks at issues dealing with racial discrimination in the criminal justice system. And there's also the issues involving the legislation that I think hopefully should pass very soon, this Congress, dealing with fixing that disparity between crack and powder cocaine, which President Obama, as well as Vice President Biden, as well as Department of Justice, have all called for the complete elimination of. I just want to say it's ironic, because just before we came up to this panel, I whispered over to Glenn Ivey. I actually congratulated him for the excellent prosecution that his office did with respect to a violent homicide that occurred in PG County, in which a very good friend of mine was murdered. So you are absolutely correct. There are other aspects other than the drug issues. But I will say what is bursting the seams of the criminal justice system and what is fueling this massive incarceration by large, I would say there's over 2 million that are incarcerated. A large portion of that are drug offenses, and a large portion of that are low-level drug offenses. So I'm hoping that, I'm going to let Mark talk about the Webb Commission, that's what I did, but I'm hoping that the comprehensive overhaul of the criminal justice system will address all of these issues, and I'll just leave you for Webb.
She gives me my marching orders too. But, well, I think it's a very good question. Why is it that we have trouble getting political traction about these issues? Partly, I think it has a lot to do with the affected parties, right? We're not talking about oil and gas lobbyists who can flood Capitol Hill, with money, political influence, favors, and things like that. The most direct victims, if you will, of our policies are, first of all, people who are victimized by crime, then people who are convicted of crime, sent to prison, and their families. And by and large, we're talking about populations that are low income, that are excluded from many of the political levers in society, that certainly are not making large campaign contributions. So it starts off, with traditional ways of getting political influence. This is the most sort of beleaguered community we know. So the challenge then, it seems to me, is, well, how do we turn this around? How do we make connections so that people with influence or ordinary Americans, view it in their interest to develop better policies? Now, some of this is happening just on its own, if you want to think of it that way. It turns out there is one very good news piece of being in a major recession, and that is that policymakers recognize that prisons are very expensive all of a sudden. Many of us have been telling them that for 20 years, and that there's other things they should do, and now all of a sudden they're paying attention because, at the state level in particular, prisons are very expensive. They're cutting into support for higher education, other services that people care about. It's also, I think we've had a much too narrow discussion about crime and punishment and victimization, what to do about it. It's very much focused on the criminal justice system. So, when crime went up, we blamed the police. When crime went down, we congratulate the police. Yes, the police are important, but they're only one part of it, and everybody else is too. And finally, I think we're beginning to have a somewhat broader conversation about that. One of the things that Glenn has done very, imaginatively in Prince George's County, and we're seeing others doing as well, is engaging the broader community in these discussions about prevention, about reentry. This is not just something criminal justice practitioners are going to do, but we have to have a much deeper conversation about where crimes comes from and what we can do about it. Finally, I will mention the Webb Commission. For those of you who may not be familiar with it, Senator Jim Webb of Virginia has proposed I guess not long after he was elected, maybe 2 years ago now, took most of us by surprise, I will say, by making at the talk at the National Press Club saying, and by the way, there's something that I find just abhorrent in our country, and that is the fact we have 2 million people behind bars. And it took all of us by surprise. There are not very many U.S. senators who come out of the blue and talk like that, and we had no indication Senator Webb was going to be the first to do it, essentially. But he's very passionate about this. He has legislation to create a National Criminal Justice Commission. He has broad bipartisan support in the Senate for it. Many people are very hopeful that this can be one of the elements of starting to change that conversation about how we think about crime and punishment and different ways to approach it.
One of the real points where there's been bipartisan connection has really been on the reentry aspect, and this is another one I stumbled into because I started saying, we need to do something for these guys when they come out, otherwise they just stay on the recidivism treadmill and they end up going back in, and that makes the public hardened to releasing guys earlier. That's when they start calling for truth in sentencing and mandatory minimums. If they come back out and they've got their act together and become productive members of the community, they're all about it. And so we started reaching out through the church, the faith community, and then ran into the Colson, the evangelical crowd. Now, the reason I got into politics is I was a kid. It was the Watergate experience. I was watching it, on TV. They were all crooks. They all need to go to jail. Down with Nixon. I still have the Washington Post Nixon Resigns edition. It was that pivotal for me. Charles Colson was one of the biggest criminals in the Watergate affair. But he went to jail, turned his life around, and now he's big on this stuff. And what we found is, in Prince George's, in Maryland in general, you get people who don't even talk to each other. The crowd that listens to Rush Limbaugh sitting down with the crowd that listens to Al Sharpton's radio show, and they're finding common ground on this issue. I think that might be a good point of attack politically here in Washington, because any hope of bipartisanship that was promised to the president before he got there has evaporated. I think the first bill he sent up, so it's going to be a tough go. But I think if we start working to build those kinds of connections, and Senator Webb is an outstanding place to start, that's a good point. The other part, too, I think, is with respect to packages. What we've got is, and I think we do, this probably is the best chance, especially on the crack powder disparity, to get something done. But I think, I've been inspired by President Obama to think big on some of these issues, because you're trained to do the sausage thing. You get your slice of the salami and move on. You cut your deal and take what you can get. But this might be the time to really throw something out that's bigger. And I think if you're going to do that in a way that's successful, you have to package together, the intervention and prevention and reentry strategies on the one hand, with the tough enforcement aspect on the other, because the public needs to know that they're going to get both. And really, since 1968, when Nixon won on the Law and Order campaign, it's been split in American politics, and it's never really come back together. This might be our best shot at doing that right now. The need is pretty great, and predominantly white communities right now, because crime has been going down in their communities, aren't kind of as exercised about it. So I think the soft on crime attacks maybe aren't as effective in some of those districts as they might have been previously. This might be a good time to try and move some of those pieces through.
you want to add anything to that?
Well, I would just add, I totally agree that the public also just sees, I mean, poll after poll, they have a different way of thinking about how you hold violent offenders accountable and how you hold nonviolent offenders accountable. Nonviolent offenders, they want to see doing things, and it's been one of the most popular reform movements of the last 30 years has been the increase in restitution and victim compensation, and the public loves that for nonviolent offenders. For violent offenders, they do want to make sure that they're safe, that people are not on the streets, and yeah, I don't think we're going to be making any progress releasing a lot of violent offenders. And that certainly is not how you would go about trying to forge a kind of public campaign to reduce the rate of incarceration. So I think all of that is right on in terms of all the public polling stuff that I've studied.
Actually, let me just put another punctuation to that, if I may. I just want to quote from death penalty attorney Brian Stevenson, because here we're dealing with, obviously, I presume it was a violent case, but it could relate to other cases as well. But he relates a sober conversation he had with a client 20 minutes prior to his execution. And Brian is saying, he began telling me about his day. He said, "Brian, it's been so strange." He said, "All day long, people have been coming up to me and saying, 'What can I do to help you?' He said, 'This morning, the guards came to me and said, "What do you want for breakfast?" And at midday, they came to me and said, "What do you want for lunch?" And in the evening, they came to me and said, "What do you want for dinner?" And he said, all day long, people have been saying, "What can I do to help you?" And he said, they've been coming to me and asking me, do I want stamps to mail my letters? Do I need coffee or water? Do I want access to the phone to call my friends and family? And I would never forget him saying in these last few minutes, he said, "Brian, it's been so strange. More people have said, 'What can I do to help you?' in the last 14 hours of my life than they ever did in the first 19 years of my life." And holding his hands, Brian couldn't help but think, yes, where were they when you were 3 years old, when you were being physically abused? Where were they when you were 7 years old, being sexually assaulted by your step-sibling? Where were they when you were 13 and 14 and you were drug addicted and trying crack cocaine and heroin? Where were they when you were 17 and you were homeless, running the streets of Birmingham, Alabama? And with these kinds of questions resonating in my mind, this man was pulled away from me, strapped in Alabama's electric chair, and executed. So I just want to say, it really should come as no surprise to us that the very people who themselves were abused and abandoned, victimized their whole lives without any type of therapeutic intervention would one day themselves become the abusers and the victimizers and stuff. What we need is this comprehensive strategy that really looks behind the cycle of incarceration and addresses these issues that are behind the cycle, issues dealing with education and health care and economic and all of those issues, wherein if there were solutions to them on the front end, we might not be confronted with them being victimized on the back end.
Oh, well, I guess a little later the questions come, right? Okay. They're not quite. They'll tell us when that happens. But let me just go ahead.
Can I follow up on that?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Okay, just because that's a great point. And one of the things I started trying cases again because I just missed the courtroom, and I took one a little while ago, and it was a drive-by shooting in which these guys had gotten mad at each other. Nobody could even remember what the dispute. What the dispute was. It was so minor that 12 months later, they couldn't remember what it was. And they drove around looking for the guy, and there was a caravan. There were girls in the car in the front and in the back who just come to watch, and because they knew there was going to be a shooting. So that we had a lot of witnesses for this case. So they drive by, and there's this guy that they're mad at standing there with a group of other people, and they roll down the windows, and two of them open fire on the crowd, and they hit the guy in the butt. They killed a dog, and one of the bullets went by the crowd into the bedroom window of the house next door and hit a woman getting dressed for work in her temple, went across her brain and killed her instantly. And so we had these two guys who were shooters, and the girlfriend of one of them had heard him say something, and we brought her in. And I was interviewing her because I was going to put her on the witness stand. And I asked her, where are you from? Where'd you go to school? And she said she went to, I won't tell you the name of the middle school, but I recognized it because one of my kids had gone there. And I said, how old are you? And she said 19, which is the same age as that kid that I had at that school. And I said, did you know Alex Ivy? And she said, yeah. And I said, what about the other two guys that shoot her? She said, well, my boyfriend went there too. See, her and her boyfriend had started dating in middle school. And at this point, I think she'd had a child already, and the baby was 3 or 4. And what she was trying to do was lean on her boyfriend to testify against the other guy, because otherwise he was going to get life in prison or some crazy sentence, and he'd get a reduced sentence if he testified against her. And I said, well, why do you think your boyfriend took the shot at this guy? And she started talking about how the sort of code on the street thing, that it's you can't back down, that you're a punk if you do. If you're a black man and you don't carry a gun, the word starts with a P. I won't use it, but it's got 5 letters. And that's not tolerated. Matter of fact, if you show that, you become victimized. People start targeting you. And I started thinking about that because, they're in the same school with my son, and not living that far away. And you get this sort of, even though there's not a big geographic disparity, there's a huge cultural disparity between some of these communities where, they feel like they have to do violent responses to almost any kind of slight. The triple murder we had on Super Bowl Sunday 2 years ago was a dispute over the game. Okay? The guy got so mad, one guy was calling him out. He got so mad, there were 3 of them. He sent one of his boys to get the gun, bring the gun out of the car, handed it to him. He shot the first 2. Third guy sees what's going on, runs for the parking lot. He hawks him down, shoots him in the back of the head and kills him. And this kid was 18 years old, and I had a chance to talk with him. Quiet, smart. You hear this guy and you can't believe it. The shooter in the first case, charismatic, talented guy. I was looking at this kid talking, I was like, boy, if we could get a degree on this kid, I could run him for office like that. He'd be flying up the ranks because he had that kind of it. You know what I mean? So, you see these kinds of things and you're like, what can we do to change that? And when you ask them, sometimes you'll get stuff like, somebody should have corrected me harder earlier, or if I'd had drug treatment earlier. But that's one source of information we really don't use. And then one last piece on that. There's a program that's been tested in some places. They're called interveners. And these are people that go into communities, typically schools, and they get to know the kids. And when they see violence about to erupt, especially in retaliation for a violent act already, they step in and talk to the guys and try and talk them out of retaliating. Because the code is you have to retaliate. And most of those guys, the ones that are the best at it, are ex-offenders. And many of them did heavy, heavy jail time. And so they have street credibility with these guys. They can talk with them and say, I would have done the same thing when I was your age, but here's why you shouldn't do it. And they can talk them out of it. And when you have communities that have, like Chicago had it for a while, crime went down, they cut the budget for it, and that's when you had the, 36 shootings in a weekend, I think it was, shortly after that. So taking advantage of the knowledge that these guys bring, I think is a key step that could really, from an intervention perspective, have a direct and immediate impact. And that's what I want. I want something that's going to bring down these homicide rates like now, because, I haven't checked my email this afternoon, but we have people getting killed day after day after day across the net. What do you have? 1.3 million shootings last year, something like that. Mostly African American males shooting African American males. Many of them dying, and that's got to stop.
But bringing down homicide rates, that's going to require what? Programs, alternatives to prison or to poverty programs, education programs, so I don't really hear many legislators talking about this at all. I mean, we hear, we've got a serious problem at Guantanamo, but how many prisoners are there? 400.
Yeah.
You hear way more about them than the 2 million that we've got at home. And
true.
Nobody's talking about repealing. I mean, with all due respect to what you said, I agree that homicide and violent crimes are a serious problem, but we have serious penalties for those things. And they're there, but we also have mandatory minimums for candy bar-sized drugs, and no one's talking about repealing the mandatory minimums. So,
well, could I just jump in there?
Sure.
Because the two things. One is that we know heavy penalties don't reduce crime. We know that. What has the biggest impact on it is really peer and community influence. Okay? So for the Boston strategy piece, for example, they don't increase incarceration. Actually, they reduce it. So if you're familiar with it, you know that homicides dropped I think it was 70 to 80% in the first 2 years when they implemented that. They didn't sustain it, but they went down. Cincinnati and High Point have had similar types of drops.
she wants to know what the Boston.
I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Here's what they did. They said, okay, instead of just going out and doing. All right, let's back up. Let's say there's a shooting. How many of you are from D.C. or the D.C. area? Okay, hands down. There's a community here called Trinidad. Okay, it's a predominantly African-American community. Had a lot of shootings. What we chose to do here in the district was saturation patrols. In fact, they basically shut the community down. They put like jersey walls around it and all of that. Police, cameras, bright lights, the whole kind of occupation thing. Now, what happens with that is, it goes down a little bit for a while, but then it comes back as soon as you pull away because you didn't change the community at all. And you didn't enlist support from the community beyond telling them you're going to be there. So they're just kind of like tolerating you being there. The Boston piece, what they did was they went in, they got coordinated with the community, especially churches and community leaders, and said, look, we've got a problem with homicides. We want to work with you in bringing it down. We want you to work with the police. And that's a big challenge in a lot of communities because a lot of them don't trust the police. They're used to the jump out patrols. I've gotten grabbed up in one of these. They send them out. If you're playing basketball at the playground right then and you're a black male, you get handcuffed. Okay? And, okay, I sounded okay, so they let me go. But a lot of times they just arrest everybody. And so in the community you get, well, what we got in Iran, actually. When we just kind of went in and started blowing everything up, and the community said, we don't want you guys here if you're going to do that. You get the same thing with these community people. Iraq, I'm sorry. Yeah, well, there was an election there. So you try and enlist the community and get them on your side, and then you do stuff like Operation Nightlife. The police they do home visits, but they don't just go with themselves. They take social workers, and they try and do arrests. But they target the arrests, so instead of doing massive arrests, you actually do investigative work. So you figure out who the 10 or 20 guys are that are actually running the open-air drug market, and instead of grabbing every black male, you just grab those 10. And then the big innovation, though, is it's called the call-in program. So what they'll do is before they arrest these guys, they call them down to federal court, because most of them are on probation, so you can order them to come to court. And I've seen a couple of these. And they'll put the homicide guy on there, and he'll do a slideshow PowerPoint presentation. And he'll put you all probably never seen these, but you've got hierarchies that show what the drug structure is, and they'll have the pictures of everybody on it. And he'll know these guys' names. He'll say, Kevin, I arrested your brother when I was on the street. I know you, and this is you, and they can flash over. This is you doing a hand-to-hand sale. And we know you work this corner, blah, blah, blah. Now, Kevin, I know you're on probation. You've got 20 years of backup time, and if we arrest you on X crime, you get an additional 10 years for that. So, and then they put the leg bracelets on them too, and now they can put up the dot map to show, Kevin, look, I know you were out past your curfew on probation last night. So here's the deal: we want you all to stop doing the open air drug market in your community, and we won't arrest you. But if you keep going, we're going to bust. It's called a takedown. We're going to arrest everybody in your group. Then the prosecutors and the big stick guys leave, and they bring in the social workers, the continuing education people, the substance abuse treatment folks, and all of that. So you get carrot and stick. And it seems to have worked in some communities. I'm sorry.
Anybody want to respond to that, and then I'll take some questions from the audience.
I just want to say that drug czar, I don't know if that's a political right name, Kurlikowski, has called for a shift in thinking away from the whole war on drugs mentality, occupation mentality, and alike towards another paradigm, the prevention paradigm. So there does seem to be a policy-making shift, at least in mind, and in the attitudes. I just wanted to add that.
Okay, good. I think you had a question?
Yes, I did. I had a question about whether criminal justice practitioners. Oh, thank you. Oh, okay. Whether criminal justice practitioners really have a place at the table when we're having new discussions about like Harlem children's zones and urban policy issues, and if that is the case, I mean, I believe we can work together, education, therefore by reducing crime. But I mean, if you guys don't have a place at the table, then that is going to be an issue.
Who do you mean? Defense counsel? Are you talking about?
I mean, defense counsel, advocates, activists. I mean, people who really understand the criminal justice system. I mean, because if you don't have education and you don't have access to a way to support your family, then the first thing you're going to do is go to the street.
Anybody want to?
Yeah, I presume defense counsel are involved with the collaborations that you have with the faith community, and they're not? Yep. Ooh, my goodness. Well, I agree they should be at the table. Absolutely, they should be at the table.
They're
All
welcome,
stakeholders, they haven't come? Is that what you're saying?
Look, I know that they're busy folks, so I don't want to throw stones. I really don't.
All stakeholders, including previously incarcerated people, need to be at the table when these policies are being formed and operationalized.
Can I just say
Yeah, sure.
I also just want to say that the beauty of these types of programs is that you're not actually creating additional prison time or felonies that have to occur in order to deter crime. It's really a way of radically reducing the number of people at the front end of the system before they even go in. It's better than reentry programming because it's like reentry before you even enter, which is ideal.
Yeah, go ahead.
It seems like we're in kind of a moment of possibility for reform. I guess the title of this panel is "The End of Mass Incarceration?" ? So we see exciting things about
Nibbling away at this.
like serious discussion about decriminalizing marijuana and the Webb Commission and these exciting, tantalizing bits of change. How big is that moment? I mean, is this just the beginning of like a 30-year process by which we gradually take down the numbers in prison, or is there a real live opportunity now, not just hope, but a real opportunity to kind of rethink how we do criminal justice in this country? Like, will the Webb Commission happen? I mean, it's a great idea. Will it actually happen? Is the political capital there now that it's even possible to have it on the table? Because I feel like it could like subside and go away again. And that's my fear, I guess, with all of this. I find it so exciting to be a young lawyer in this time and passionate about criminal justice reform, but it seems like it could just slip away. So I wonder if in your work on this, you could speak to how real that moment is.
Well, let me start off with that. I think there's no question it's real, but we should think about where it comes from. I don't think it came only from Senator Webb or President Obama in the White House or things like that. I think it goes back a while. Most of us on the panel have been doing this for some time and can remember some of the pretty bitter ideological wars on crime going back to the 80s and 90s or so, and it's a very polarizing time. That has changed for a number of years now. With a handful of exceptions. There's not the same sort of nasty debates about, crime and punishment that we had back in the 90s when the federal crime bill was being adopted and 3 strikes and you're out policies were sweeping the country. The Bush administration, for all the bad things one might want to say about their criminal justice policies, was very supportive of reentry programming and held conferences and things like that, too. So there has been a shift. It's anybody who works on crime policy knows that when it comes to political parties, you can't just assume Democrats will be reform-minded and Republicans will be punitive, because it's much more complicated than that, and we need to recognize that to make things change. Some people believe that things are changing because of the fiscal crisis. I mentioned that before. That's true, but I think only because a lot of things have been moving over the last 10 or 15 years. We now have a generation of alternatives to incarceration, a generation of drug courts that demonstrate that treatment can be a reasonable approach to drug problems. These are not experiments anymore. These are real things that judges across the country are using. They're welcomed in communities and the like. So all that stuff, I think, is very encouraging. The Webb Commission would be sort of icing on the cake if it does the right thing. I mean, I don't want to put too many eggs in that basket, but it's just an indication that the openings are there now. The question is, how significant are these changes? And there, I think it's a more sobering moment we have right now. For all the drug courts in operation, for all the reform legislation, for all the consensus that we need to do things differently, the prison population is still going up each and every year. We have a record number of drug offenders in prison. It's not growing the way it was before, but it's not declining either. So we have a problem there. And one of the very challenging parts of the problem is, Glenn, of course, appropriately pointed out, the problem. We have to separate drug crimes from violent crimes. What do people care about? And that certainly makes sense. The challenging part of that is that just because people want us to do something about violent crime, and just because there's going to be a lot of people convicted of violent crime in prison, doesn't tell us how long they should stay in prison. I've done a lot of work with lifers over the year in prison. People have a life sentence for usually murder, armed robbery. And I think it's fairly typical across the country. You see the lifers who are 30, 35, 40 years old. They're very different than the wild kids at 18, 19, 20 who had a gun and didn't know what they were getting involved with. They've grown up in prison. They've matured. Not all of them, but many of them are not the threats to public safety they might have been 20 years before that. So how much time should they be in prison? How much time is appropriate? How much time for public safety, for needs of the victim? There's no easy answers there, but unless we deal with some of those questions, we divert some drug offenders from prison, but the people at the long end of sentences keep stacking up, and that's a good part of the reason why we're not seeing those numbers go down. So at some point, we have to be able to deal with those questions, too.
And also, many of the policy measures that we see in Congress right now are the result of listening to people out there in the field, listening to practitioners and the like, looking at evidence-based practices. I saw Nicole Austin Hillary, who just came in from the Brennan Center. The Justice Integrity Act, which I mentioned earlier, really was, part of it was inspired from a report that the Brennan Center and the National Institute on Law and Equity, group of African-American prosecutors, basically collaborated on, and Justice Integrity Act, a lot of that came out of that. Again, the Youth Promise Act came as a result of looking at evidence-based practices of programs that work, that are out there in the field. And we need multidisciplinary approaches. Not one way is going to do it. We do need to talk and communicate with each other. And the defense, I think I probably know why they probably are not at the table then, after I heard you saying that people are threatened with wholesale arrest, whatever. But it's communication, okay? And we can, beg to differ. Okay, that's going to happen. But unless we come together and really work on a comprehensive approach, we're going to continually only have knee-jerk reactions that are not going to comprehensively solve the problem.
The issue to watch on this is budgetary. So if you're in a community, we went through this in Annapolis. If you're in a state where you're saying we've got to reduce the amount of people because it's too expensive to have them in jail, which is part of the impetus in a lot of these states, Alabama, Texas, for example. Great. The challenge then becomes, what are you going to do with that $25,000 that you saved? If you go put it in something different, well, like building roads, for example, okay. But can you peel off $3,000 or $4,000 of that for substance abuse treatment? or job placement. So instead of taking it all out of the criminal justice issue and assuming it's going to fix itself, we're going to turn these guys loose and budgetarily do nothing to support them. That's going to be a problem, and that's when you loop back. You start having guys that came out and they reoffend, then the public gets mad, and that's where you get to the mid-'80s again. But if you can take some of that money and use it for some of these programs, I think it'll make a difference. I've got a drug court, but I've got 200 spots. We did 30,000 cases last year. Three-quarters of the guys that come through are testing positive for something. That's way more than 200 slots, but I don't have any place to put them. That's the piece to look at.
And that's a concept that I've heard of called justice reinvestment, reinvesting back in the system from the savings that you save from not mass incarcerating everyone.
Yeah. Can I do candy bar? Yes,
Bring defense to the table.
Yes, sir.
My name is Paul Butler, and I'd like to ask each one of the panelists what they think about my new book on mass incarceration.
A hip-hop theory of justice.
Actually, as I go around and talk to people in various communities that you've talked about, especially poor and minority communities, there's a fear of the police that's at some point hate isn't a too strong a word to use. So I'm wondering what's the progressive position on the police?
Well, I mean, okay, I'll do the candy bar later. I think what you get is this kind of whipsaw effect with the community. And so a lot of times they'll get the saturation jump out stuff where everybody gets arrested. And that pisses them off, and it should. Then you'll have somebody that gets killed in the community, and then they're like, swear to God, first thing out of their mouth, we need more police in the community. And so you're trying to, okay, well, how do we walk that line? Well, I think the key is the policing strategy, and this is what I was trying to point to earlier. If they're going to keep doing these jump out saturation, we're going to grab everybody, we'll stop you because you got tinted windows, you got something hanging from your rear view mirror, that kind of stuff. It's really transparent kind of, stops. Well, that's going to be a problem. But if you can get a strategy that moves you past that, maybe it's the Boston strategy, maybe it's something different, where they go about it in a different way, where they're reaching out to the community in a different way, then that helps. Now, the snitching part, we're going to go on our private thing here, but witnesses in the community help you overcome that, okay? The reason the police do a lot of this stuff is because they don't have any other way to get the information. So let's say there's a homicide. We'll take the Flowers murder. I don't even have to look at what the police did. They flooded the community, I'll bet you. They started, trying to interview as many people as they could. They started arresting anybody they could for drugs in the area. They started shaking down prostitutes in the area. And they started, what do you know? Because at the end of the day, they don't want to lock up the prostitute. They don't care if she gets back out or not. They just want to know if she knows something. They want that information. What's the word on the street? Who did the shooting? Why did they do it? And once they get that, they're done with it. But the damage has already been done. You've been going around grabbing people up. If we can find other ways to get the information for the big cases that we're after, then I think you can change that strategy. But right now, they've been doing this for 30 years, and it's really hard to get them to think about how to do it differently.
And one of the problems is, on the federal level, the only way to get out from under a mandatory minimum sentence is if you provide valuable information to the prosecutor. Who has that valuable information? Does Tyrone on the corner have it? Not necessarily. Does the prosecutor on the corner? Not necessarily. Usually it's the high-level people. But what happens is that the incentives are there to go after, again, the low-hanging fruit. And a lot of times the information that comes out is suspect. Okay, and it really has created real problems. There's a movie that's out there right now, the popular movies or whatever, called American Violet, based on a true story out in Hearn, Texas, where a young woman was swept up in a housing complex, drug bust or whatever, based on the testimony of an informant. The testimony clearly was not credible, but what began to happen wholesale, because people are faced with long sentences. Many times they'll go in and accept a plea even though they know that they're innocent. Same situation happened in Tulia, Texas, where nearly half of the town's African-American population was arrested and herded into prison on bogus drug charges on the sole uncorroborated testimony of a white undercover task force officer whose modus operandi was to record purported drug buys on his arms and on his legs. most of those people, I think all of them got out. But, you know, Paul Butler, I just want to say, for those who don't know, even before his new book came out with Hip Hop Theory of Justice, right? Paul really, I think, was the epitome of showing the problems with public confidence in the criminal justice system, largely as a result of actions of police, actions of prosecutors, and the drug laws in particular, because his concept that he came out, and only he, as a former prosecutor, could do it. I could not. I would have been laughed out of court if I had come up with that. But his law review article was called Jury Nullification, Black Power in the Criminal Justice System. Am I correct? But it got attention because he had that credibility. He was a former prosecutor, and he was trying to say, look, you keep locking up these low-level, nonviolent offenders who the jury consistently says that their arrest and incarceration will have no appreciable impact on the flow of drugs in the communities, and juries began nullifying, began not convicting. We don't want a system like that. There must be public confidence in the system. And one way to bring that about, bring everybody to the table. Okay, let's hash everything
They're all
out.
welcome.
Make sure that there's cover up there for policymakers to do the right thing. There's no dichotomy between being smart on crime and tough on crime. You got to be both.
And
Go ahead.
can I just say that, you know, like we've talked about this before, but, you know, I've interviewed wives and partners of people who are incarcerated on drug charges and who have also sat on juries, and for them, whether or not to convict someone that they think is guilty is a real issue. And that's a tragic position for them to be in, because they're weighing the cost of mass incarceration, putting their neighbor's son away in a way that they know is counterproductive and destructive to families and communities in their neighborhood, or, you know, letting the guy who sold her baby's father drugs and you know, got him hooked, got him stealing the TV, the kids' toys, et cetera, from their home. And neither of those choices is a good choice. It's a tragic position that they are in when the only things that they can think about are destructive to their community. And so it's hopefully progress can be made, and you start to see a little bit more trust and a little bit more. I think you'll see a lot more cooperation with police, and just a change in sentiment once you have significant change in the way that the criminal justice system treats people who are arrested.
We have a
Or
question here.
suspected. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I guess I'd like to sow some seeds of disagreement to try to get some sparks going, maybe. But
Fire it up.
I guess I'd like to speak to this sort of, let me say, for lack of a better word, whatever, beltway phenomenon for this quest for bipartisanship. So right now we're all pretty much agreeing that we need more investment in government programs to help prevent a lot of these criminals from going to jail in the first place. However, to move from where we are to that goal, there's this belief that we need to bring in all these parties who have this ideology where they think government is the root of the problem. And I've seen recently where some of the worst bills in Congress have been bipartisan. The FISA bill, the Patriot Act, the criminal omnibus bill. I mean, people have flocked away from the conservative party in droves to come follow a progressive path. Why not we lead them down that progressive path and shun those people who believe that the government is the root of the problem? Government investment in social programs is the root of the problem. Do they really need to be at the table?
Well, let me just say, the Second Chance Act, the reentry bill, would not have passed if it had not been for bipartisan support. But not only that, it really was the other side of the aisle that initially really led that bill for reform. even I was even surprised myself. Bobby Scott's Youth Promise Act has about 15 or 16 Republicans on it right now, and I know that bill has a price tag. So I don't quite understand it, but I guess maybe what it is, the bill is hard to
take care of that.
Okay, that's right. It's just a bill. It's just authorization, not appropriations. But I hear you loud and clear. But the problem is, even though we have a Democratic administration, Congress, and the like, we basically have been told that the Democratic leadership is not even going to let the crack bill come to the floor unless it has some bipartisan support. It's not a situation even where the Dems are all great on these issues, Republicans are not. On criminal justice issues, really, it's a crapshoot. We won't even go into the Clinton administration era where he left the campaign trail to oversee over an execution of a mentally retarded person. But I mean, I'm just saying, it's been on criminal justice issues, it is very, very hard across the board. And we need bipartisan support, really, not only for anything to pass, but for there to be buy-in and there to be a political cover for everybody, shall we say, to do the right thing.
I mean, in the wake of the Willie Horton ad, which was a seminal moment in campaign politics, what they came away with, and by they I mean like senators and congressmen, was how one case can blow you up. Just one instance can really blow you up if you've exposed yourself to the soft on crime kind of attacks. And so there's a lot of sensitivity about it. And that's why you hear a lot about it. The other part of, too, is I think the public, I think Obama's demonstrated that they don't have to have bipartisanship, but they like the fact that he's at least trying to reach out to them. And so the counter it gives him is, hey, look, I'm trying, but they're not showing up, which is what I would say about the defense attorneys coming to those. But,
me to the table.
Come on. So,
go ahead.
I'm glad you brought up Texas. That's where I'm from, and so I guess I have a more pessimistic perspective on hopes for reform. I hear you talk about policy reform going on at the federal level, and that's promising. And you could even see the state legislature of Texas beginning to think about the fiscal impact of mass incarceration. But it seems like you're ignoring a little bit the role of prosecutorial discretion. In Texas, our district attorneys are elected countywide, and it's still a mostly Republican state. So the way you get elected DA is to be the most conservative guy in the Republican primary. So in places like Williamson County and until recently Harris County, which is a Republican county with a very, very different city core, you've got prosecutors that are always going to go for whatever the maximum is allowed by statute. So I'm wondering, where does consideration of prosecutorial discretion by elected partisan political officials come into hopes for reform in this area?
Good question.
Well, I mean, it comes from the electorate. I think the guy to watch is Craig Watkins, who is the DA in Dallas right now. And I told him, I said, brother, you're really out there. Let me know if you need some help, like raising money or whatever, because you're gonna have a big one coming up. The 60 Minutes piece on him. Do you know who this guy is? He's the DA in Dallas, and what he did was he ran, I believe he was a public defender, wasn't he?
Yeah.
He ran against the DA and won because they were having so many problems, and they had so many people who had been wrongly convicted. And Craig then brought in the Innocence Project into the DA's office,
Right.
okay, and let them go through the files, yes. And they started finding guys who were actually wrongly convicted. Well, when he first started doing that, I was talking. I said you're making recommendations as to things to do to cover yourself, but basically the DA regime that he beat out was killing him in the paper, and the Dallas Morning News was running with what they were saying. When 60 Minutes did the piece and they actually found wrongly convicted people, it seemed that shifted a little bit for him. So he looks like he's in better shape. But if he gets knocked off, your DAs in Texas are going to move even further to the right. If he can sustain it and get reelected, and then I think you might have a ray of hope there with DAs being a little more progressive.
Go ahead.
I think we're missing a part of the discussion here, and I'd be happy to stand up, but I'd be standing up right in your face.
Please.
I'm one lawyer. I'm one lawyer. Oh, sorry. Well, we'll stand up. I'm one lawyer. I live in Louisville, Kentucky. I do nothing but sue jails and prisons in Kentucky for killing inmates. And I think part of what needs to be discussed here, and part of the inevitable result of this huge increase in the inmate population in our prisons and jails in this country, with a corresponding decrease in the tax revenue that's needed to take care of them, is that we've got 2.3 million people in a correction system in this country, and the way we treat them is a shame on this country and on this Constitution before the rest of the world. I don't, the judge made reference to it. We're going to be talking about Gitmo detainees here in a minute. But there's not going to be any discussion at this convention about the Eighth Amendment, about whether the deliberate indifference standard makes any sense, and the impediments that imposes on getting cases. The PLRA, Prison Litigation Reform Act, which Human Rights Watch came out this week, thank goodness, and just flat called it, it's a human rights violation. And the problem, when we talk about reducing the population in the correction system, that's fine. But this is not an antiseptic issue. The problem with, one of the primary problems with this population in prisons and jails is the fact that right now, every day, throughout this country, as we sit here having this debate, there are hundreds of people in American jails and prisons, American citizens, who are suffering from drug withdrawal untreated, who are dying because they don't have access to medical care, and who are being killed by guards, if not sexually assaulted. And I would like your thoughts on how the conditions crisis in jails and prisons can be used to augment or supplement what you are trying to achieve in reducing mass incarceration. Because I tell you what, I mean, there are poster children out there. There's pictures I can show. I told the folks at lunch today, I won't discuss with you my cases because I've seen it make people physically ill. This is happening to American people, our friends and neighbors, Americans behind bars being incarcerated by Americans and guarded by Americans. And it's a scandal. It's an international scandal. And I would like your thoughts on how that figures into all of this political discussion.
Well, if I could just start a little bit. For starters, I'm not a lawyer. I certainly don't do prison conditions litigation or anything. The good news is, I don't disagree with anything you said, the good news is compared to where we were 30 years ago, because of people like you and lawyers around the country, that in many cases conditions are at least somewhat better than they were 30 years ago. Now, the problem is we have so many more people in prison and so many more prisons and terrible conditions and not enough lawyers and activists to take it on. But, we made some progress, and it's because of a lot of hard work. The second piece of good news is I think there's a reasonable number of people, corrections officials, who care about this, and they're caught in a bind as well, because they're told by legislative policies they've got to increase their prison systems, and they can build the prisons, but they don't get money for programming for health care and all the other things too. And many of them, I think, are decent people, would like to run a decent system, but are caught in a bind as well. It's a very challenging argument to try to make to the public, right? We know that a lot of people want to lock the door and throw away the key. I think on certain issues there's public support we can build on. Certainly incarcerating mentally ill people, is something that I think many Americans find troubling. And, as you well know, the numbers are huge. 1 of every 6 people in prison has a history of mental illness. Most Americans have some kind of direct experience with somebody who's had issues of mental illness, and you don't need to be very sophisticated to figure out a prison is not a good situation for those people. And, our prisons have become the primary caretakers of those people. So I think we have some room there. I'm not overly optimistic that just based on poor conditions we can make all those arguments and get support, but it's clearly part of what we need to do. Part of it has to do with, do we really think we're making people better by keeping them housed in these conditions, or are we just, creating ticking time bombs, making people worse? And I think at that level, some people can get it, perhaps.
I just want to say I really appreciate your comment, because I cut my legal teeth litigating prison condition cases. This is before the PLRA. These were in the days before the PLRA. You could get attorney's fees and all like that. But I will say this: the conditions, if it weren't for what was going on in the prisons, you probably wouldn't have had the Chuck Colson coming out the way he came out, the Pat Nolans, people on the other side of the aisle, high public figures, really seeing what's going on behind prison doors, coming out with advocacy around the Prison Rape Elimination Act. That probably would not have happened if they had not been there and then come out and been the voices to raise issues like that. So there really does need to be a lot more advocacy around the Prison Litigation Reform Act in particular, so that lawyers like you now, who can be even more effective than what you are now in being able to give remedies for what's going on behind the walls.
For those who don't know, the PLRA was an act passed by Congress during the Clinton administration that really further restricted the abilities of federal courts to deal with the kinds of prison conditions you're talking about. I've been advised by my monitor here that we're done. But so I want to thank the panelists and thank all the good questions.